where we stand in the FFPC main event and some of our biggest conclusions from the 2023 season. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, you are back home right now visiting family. I will be flying out tomorrow to Atlanta first, and driving down to New Orleans with a buddy for the Sugar Bowl. My Huskies are playing. I'll be there over New Year's. If they win, I have tickets already sort of reserved if they win as part of the Husky ticket allocation for the national championship in Houston as well. There's some possibility that I won't even travel back during that time and we'll just stay down in the South because have some family down that way. And all the flights and everything to and from Seattle are very expensive for these cities right now. So we'll see kind of how all of that plays out. But what that means, essentially, the reason I'm detailing all these travel plans and everything is not necessarily going to have a huge show today in store because you have some stuff to do with family. Probably won't have a show early next week. Not really sure when we'll be back on, right? But we will be at some point, I think the week prior to the playoffs is probably the next time we can definitely expect a show, and we can talk through some of the playoff stuff. We love to do the playoff contests and those types of things. So that's some fun stuff we have coming, Shawn. But yeah, how you doing? How's the Christmas and how's the fam?
It was good. It started off with fantastic early week. Well, I mean, it was hit and miss. There were some good things, some bad things with the main event team. We knew we were close enough that if some of the players went off, that we would be in the mix. And then Puka Nacua has a big game on Thursday. That was very exciting. Unfortunately, James Cook wasn't able to go back to back, so that hurt us a little bit. But then you're looking at the Sunday decisions, and it's a matter of, do we flip to Tua? Because we almost certainly are going to be playing Jared Goff in week 17, or do we stick with the player whose team has just looked better offensively? And after you watch the Dolphins in that first month, it would feel crazy to think that we'd be talking about Detroit and their gaggle of weapons being the better play. But obviously you've got some injury concerns with Tyreek Hill. You've got some injury concerns with the running backs, which did play out a little bit. Jeff Wilson gets into that game. And for Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane managers, to know that they're kind of both banged up to the extent that Jeff Wilson would make sense as somebody who's going to take some of those touches in that game, that part obviously frustrating. But Ben, we decided to go ahead and stick with Jared Goff for the 3-week stretch. We have Amon-Ra St. Brown, and it was kind of good news, bad news there, because the Lions did look good on the road in the Dome against Minnesota, scored a lot of points. Unfortunately, Jahmyr Gibbs, somebody that we have spent a lot of the year praising, was simply too good. And he was scoring from distance. He was scoring from close. We got a little bit more of a running back game here. Jared Goff doesn't go off in a big way, but obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown continues to pour on the points. And that moves us in the direction of Breece Hall. And to see him go for almost 200 yards from scrimmage, to hit almost 100 yards in both phases, to get those rushing scores, and certainly the twisting one. I thought that the T. Higgins touchdown the previous week had been one of the coolest touchdowns I've ever seen, and yet Hall's touchdown in this game
was a better version of it.
Yeah, purely from a skill perspective, is a better version of it. The things he had to do to stay in, the body control, the effort, all of that. So Ben, when you have a guy in your lineup who goes over 40 and you've had a couple of other big games, then you're starting to get excited. I was trying to do the first half of the games at home, working on my content for RotoViz, then flying during some of the second wave of games, obviously watching on Christmas, the Chiefs, the Eagles, the 49ers, Ravens, and then we were very excited at one point there, and then things did melt down. How was your experience of kind of going through the various stages? Because the NFL really stretched these games out over the full extent of what they could have possibly done for week 16.
Yeah, that was a little maddening, especially with you understand why they're doing it. You understand that for most casual people, it was probably a blast to have more island games at this point and be able to watch even more football. But with the holidays and everything, and for people like you and I who basically don't miss games and then also would like to spend time with our family a little bit, it was a little bit frustrating, obviously, to have this kind of schedule and try to manage both of those things, especially with this much on the line. Where, like, I know for me, we're opening presents Christmas morning. I got the Chiefs game on in the background, and I'm just tilting that Harrison Butker is not getting any points for our team. We'll get to the kicker discussion in a minute, but and still trying to like have a good time for the kids. And like, and I told you I was at my in-laws' house, and there, a lot of the people there are just rooting against the Chiefs naturally because they're like, this is a dynasty. And it's like, oh, everything's going bad for the Chiefs. And I'm like, you don't understand. Like, I need the Chiefs to do well. But, obviously trying to just have a good time in those situations. I think I did a pretty good job of it. Obviously, it's important, when you're a father, when you have kids and those things, that you also have to be in the moment and to try to balance those emotions. I've told you this. I've learned a lot from you over the last few years, and as regularly as we talk doing this show about how to frame things and how to think positively. You're such an optimist. I've joked about this in the early years of our pod a ton, where like you're the optimist, I'm the pessimist. When we talk about a lot of these things, we have that sort of yin yang thing. But just being in situations like that, it was a reminder that to be thankful for our friendship and the things that I've learned from you, because that was very helpful while things weren't necessarily going great on Christmas. But you were talking earlier, the decision between Goff and Tua was one we labored on. They ended up scoring very similarly. It was interesting because we talked through, typically we're really shooting for ceiling scenarios, and we talked through it, and it felt like both actually had very similar floor to ceiling decisions. Just for anyone who was curious about our start sit decision here, very similar ceilings. Neither really has much rushing value. Both obviously in good spots to score, high total games, similar like implied lines. Miami being at home against a tougher defense, the Lions being on the road, but against a more beatable defense, put them in similar spots in terms of what you would expect from the offenses. So the ceiling side, we couldn't really break the tie. And we had Amon-Ra, like you said. We also have Waddle on this team. We talked through like ownership in the contest, because it is this big 3-week sprint, and that was very similar as well. The number of teams, the percentage of teams they're on is very similar. The number of teams ahead of us that they were on did lean slightly to Goff, but like I went through it all, and I sent to you kind of all the numbers, and I didn't feel like that it was a meeting, like it should be a decision point for us after I got through all of that. So ultimately, the thing that really, of all the things that couldn't really break the tie, the thing for me, I would describe it more as like a floor decision, which usually we're not making decisions on floor, but it felt like the Lions offense couldn't possibly fail really poorly against the Vikings. It did seem at least feasible that the Dolphins would struggle against the Cowboys. I think at one point you mentioned to me the possibility of, after the Cowboys had a tough game in Buffalo the week prior, that they could just win, outright, like dominate the game, play really good defense. Miami's offense can be not gimmicky, but like with banged up skill position players, they can get shut down. Sometimes they just look.
And if the Dolphins are so concentrated on Waddle and Hill, and unfortunately, Waddle, the player we need, is the one who goes out in this game. But you have a path to where if the touchdowns go through the running backs, that especially there's not enough total ball. Because one of the things with Detroit is even when the volume goes or the scoring goes through the running backs, except for these road matchups that are bad, and outdoors, which it wasn't. But Detroit didn't seem like they had that situation where you could get both a low overall output and that output would go through the running backs, and that Tua could, come in with a 6 or a 7. We've seen good quarterbacks get absolutely destroyed. The last week's MVP candidate, Brock Purdy, get absolutely destroyed. As you're describing it, that seemed more likely to happen with Tua, even though we weren't projecting that for either player, obviously.
And then, but the flip side of that is that little concern with the Lions that maybe all the touchdowns do go through the running backs. Where I was going with this was the Lions do score 4 offensive touchdowns. The Dolphins score 1. I mean, we pretty much got that part of it right. If you tell me that before, it's a no-brainer. We're taking Goff. Unfortunately for Goff's scoring, they ran the heck out of the ball. 3 of those 4 TDs were on the ground. He throws 1. Tua does wind up with the better game. He throws their only touchdown in Miami. The flip side of Miami only scoring the 1 TD is they settle for 5 field goals, Sean. And we had a decision. Well, we didn't really talk through it. It wasn't a massive decision. Again, you think through the different scenarios. The Chiefs playing the Raiders at home seems like a plenty great spot to play Harrison Butker, who we have on this team. We also had Jason Sanders, but it wasn't something. I mean, they're playing also at home, but they're playing the Cowboys. There's a much that we just talked through. There's some scenarios for the Dolphins to not score very many points. They do move the ball in this game. Sanders winds up kicking 5 field goals, 3 from 50 yards. He scores 23 kicker points in a situation where we're near the top of this overall sprint, but you need every point you can get because you're playing against all of the other best teams. The team that is now leading, by the way, Sean, and we talked about the different strategies and the ways to try to pull levers and leverage things. The team that's now leading is an Amari Cooper, David Njoku team that went out and added Joe Flacco, understanding if Flacco's going to start, then I need to be able to play this as a stack. They probably weren't doing great after the first week. I guess they were doing fine. They had a strong first week as I'm looking at it now, but went out and played the Flacco, Amari, David Njoku double stack in this tournament as like a differentiation tactic and with the stack elements. And they got the monster game that propels them now into first place by a few points. Really interesting decision on their part. Pretty, cool how that worked out. What was so clearly a strategic thing that goes back to the decision to add Flacco when they had the 2 Browns on this roster that was going to be in the shootout. They're already thinking that far ahead, and they pulled that lever in the shootout. So just a little hat tip to that manager for making that decision and it going well. You're playing against every possible combination is what I'm getting at. Flacco scores 30 points for this team, and then he also gets the monster score out of Amari, and Njoku has the strong total. It is, not every possible combination, but it is very likely that when there are good things that are happening, that somebody has them in this contest. So you want to,
and you think about some of these players where you're like, I mean, they didn't have a good season. I would argue they weren't good picks to start with, and you're thinking that's going to have them a little bit underrepresented. But underrepresented doesn't mean not represented. And I mean, you look through the teams that we have who are in the mix. You think about your Best Ball Mania teams that are in the mix, and one of the things that you look at on those teams are what are some players that we pulled through who are not going to be on a ton of teams. And if those players go off, then, you're in great shape to win. I'm not even saying that's necessarily the case with Amari Cooper, but it does happen, right? I mean, think about the different teams where you have Jahan Dotson, and you're like, that dude should not be on teams that have advanced. But if he does have a good week, I was joking with Pete about that. And obviously he didn't. But those guys are there, and then that was the thing that was like early on offsetting some of my Breece Hall joy. Is just that, what are the odds that Breece Hall has a 40-plus point game on the same day that Amari Cooper scores 50?
And so I'm looking at it now. We are at this point in 14th. There are, I think I got to 4 or maybe 5 teams ahead of us with Amari. I think 3 of them also had Njoku. The very top one I mentioned had Flacco and both of them. The team in second has both Amari and Njoku. The team in 8th has both Amari and Njoku. So there's 3 teams in the top 10 that had both of those players. It is, like you said, it's not an underrepresented doesn't mean completely not represented. And so when these players hit, they're going to hit big. We obviously do not have Amari in our lineup. We also didn't have Jason Sanders in our lineup. We played Harrison Butker. Sanders goes for 23. We get the 2 points from Butker the next day. And that's a 21-point difference that we're still in 14th right now. We are trailing the overall leader by 43, a pretty solid margin.
But if you made the right kicker decision.
Right.
I mean, 20 is very doable.
Yep. That makes you feel like that's where I'm at with it as well. And it's tough, but you're like, man, if we just had the kicker right, 20, and also, right now we're in 14th, we have to climb over 13 other teams. We would be in like 7th, I think it is. If you or maybe it's 8th or 9th, those are all clustered right in that range, but we would be in the back half of the top 10. There'd be about 5 to 7 teams that would be now behind us as opposed to ahead of us. And part of the issue is some of the players that we have that have done very well are on a lot of the teams that are ahead of us. Although, as we just noted, a lot of them, the ones ahead of us, do have like Amari and Njoku, who are players that we do not have. Christian McCaffrey is on the leader. But like the top team has Trey McBride. Our quarterback is Trey McBride. The second team also has Trey McBride. So anything Trey McBride does for us is not going to help us close this gap. It's just the way that to think of it.
It will be nice to jump some of those other teams. And Ben, as you're looking at it there, I mean, we have the Hall-Cook double. And obviously one of the interesting things that's happened in the first couple of weeks is that they both had a huge game and a terrible game. More likely that they'll have, mediocre games in the finals. And we have the Browns Jets tonight, if I'm not mistaken. You can look at that as, perhaps not being ideal for a Hall. There is a setup there where if the Browns are more effective taking him away in the receiving game, you can get a pure dud. Because one of the things that happened for the Jets last week is their offense outside of specifically Hall was still extraordinarily bad. So bad that Jacoby Brissett and the Commanders can rally for a lead at one point. On the other hand, I mean, Breece Hall, James Cook, two of the most explosive running backs in the NFL. If they hit on the same week, then that changes our ceiling. And obviously we've already had 2 pretty good ceiling games to be in 14th at this point. Are you feeling like that combo? And the other thing here that happened, we get that early 50-yard reception from Waddle, and Ben, for him to then suffer 2 injuries after that was rough as a viewer. And then I had mentioned to you, DeAndre Swift, who's our third running back. You can look at him as flex player, what have you. When his touchdown was overturned, I don't know what the general consensus is on that. My feeling on it seemed like the feeling of the officiating expert and the commentators was that there wasn't enough there to overturn it. I mean, if you told me the standard is more likely than not, I guess I could see overturning it. I don't believe what the standard supposedly is. I mean, if you look at that play versus the play the previous week where there's an interception that stops the Seahawks' final drive where the foot is clearly not down and the call is not overturned, and you have this call that is overturned. I did have a bit of an emotional reaction at that point, and I don't know if that sounds like relatable or just you guys are in 14th. Don't be crying about the things that aren't going right. But Ben, one of the things that is weird about fantasy is that it actually becomes harder in its own way when you're so close. And so it
totally,
you're excited to be at that point, but then when something when it doesn't work on those 3 players kind of in a row with Waddle and the kicker and Swift. Now, one of the things I should mention is that Swift does end up having a pretty good game for him. And you're thinking because of those first 2 drives that could have also been Swift touchdowns, I mean, he could have had a 30-plus point game in this.
That's how I felt as well watching the early part of it was, he doesn't have the receiving role as much right now. You need a multi-touchdown game, and those early opportunities that weren't touchdowns, I still felt like he could have a decent game, but it was like, that's what I felt was being taken away was the potential for the 30-point game. And then by the end, you're like, man, it did work out in such a way that he could have had a 30-point game here.
And we're very glad that, he does score the points that he does and keep us kind of in that range and keep us within shooting distance. And if he were to somehow get in for multiple touchdowns in week 17, I mean, we probably need to score 225 to win.
Yeah. 220, 225. And Waddle is now hurt. And so one of the levers we do get to play, and I messaged you. I'm actually really excited about this. I messaged you about it. We don't have a ton of bench ceiling options as a result of Ramondre Stevenson getting put on IR. He was one of our pieces throughout the season. and some of the rookies that we have rostered not really having shown enough to be clear plays right now. Jameson Williams, Josh Downs, Jalen Hyatt, Quentin Johnston, all on this team. None of those receivers are guys that I feel comfortable throwing into the lineup at this point. Maybe you could talk me into Downs, but he's just been really tough for the last month plus, as opposed to what he was doing earlier in the year. We do have Kyle Pitts. This is a Kyle Pitts plus Trey McBride team. And so he is very likely to be our flex. I messaged you if we can get like an 8-122, 8 catches, 120 yards, 2 touchdowns. It's the kind of game that I've been saying Kyle Pitts can definitely have. They're playing Chicago. I mean, it's not like it's a strong – Chicago's defense has been a lot better lately, but it's not like it's like an elite defense or anything like that. I certainly don't think it's likely, right, in an outdoor game up in Chicago or anything like that. But Pitts does have some decent little plays over the last few weeks, a longer touchdown in 2 of his last 3 games. The potential for him to have a couple of long, like really one long touchdown and then maybe score again at some point.
Well, let's be very straightforward about this. Kyle Pitts still more talented than Amari Cooper. What's Taylor Heineke going to do to show that? I mean, he's not going to let Joe Flacco get one over on him in the really terrible backup quarterback competition to become Superman.
Here's a fun stat, not a fun stat, a depressing stat. Kyle Pitts has more than 6 targets in the game one time since week 5. He had 11 in week 5. He had 9 in week 3. In the first few, I mean, it seems almost impossible, but in the first few games of the year, he actually had some of these high target games. He's been worse since, or used less, or however you want to frame that. He's drawn more than 6 targets one time since then. Since that 5th game, he had an 8-target game against the Jets a few weeks back, only caught 4 of those, has not had more than 4 receptions since way back then in a game. I still think it's possible. You look at what George Pickens did last week. That's a guy who had struggled in a similar way for an extended period of time. But the thesis that we initially had,
it's
one of those things.
Very straightforward. Kyle Pitts is much more talented than George Pickens.
There you go. He's one of the things that's fun about Best Ball is I actually had a George Pickens team that was live in the Best Ball Mania semifinals. This team ends up failing to get there because Christian McCaffrey doesn't score at the end of that Christmas night game. He got the carry at the 2-yard line and got to the 1, and then on 3rd down they do a drop back pass and get sacked. Just insane. Sam Darnold's got to throw that ball away. I'm still tilting about that. If you're going to call a drop back shotgun pass, your quarterback has to be able to throw it out of the end zone. So on 4th down, you can go back to a Christian McCaffrey run. Obviously, I'm saying this because I'm biased. My team would have advanced in the Best Ball Mania finals if Christian McCaffrey scores there. I end up losing by less than 2 points. But that was a team that had Pickens. And so you're like, this was the thesis for Pickens all year. He didn't do well all year, but you end up getting to realize the benefit of him having this explosive game in week 16, which is like a really fun element of it. In season long, nobody in their right mind is playing Pitts, but it is not crazy for a player like Pitts in an offense holding him down with the type of explosive talent that he does have to envision him having an explosive game. And in a tight end premium format, that 8-122 game that I was telling you, I think it would be 36 points when I added it up. You're talking about something that no one else near the top of the leaderboard is going to have in their lineup, and gives you, and for us, for people that have been Kyle Pitts fans for the last couple of years, big time on the show, what kind of a story would it be if Kyle Pitts had that game in a situation where it, propelled us into, I don't want to say to win the thing, but into the top 5 or whatever. We had some really fun, epic finish because of a Kyle Pitts game. And it really is the right play. We're not forcing it. Like we sort of have to play Kyle Pitts with Jalen Waddle banged up. He's the ceiling guy with the tight end premium element. Is it going to happen? No. Arthur Smith hates fun, and the Falcons.
He's got one game this season over 60 yards.
Yeah, there's nothing about anything that suggests that
running
this is
hot
likely.
On touchdowns, Ben. I mean, we know that touchdowns come in clumps and they cause other touchdowns, right? Isn't that the understanding?
Yes. And he has 2 in the last 3 games, which, Sean, he has 3 on the year. So 2 in the last 3 games is more than he had in all the rest of the games combined. And also only 6 in his entire career because he had 1 in his first year and 2 last year and 3 this year. Really just an elite touchdown producer. To think that he could have a multi-TD game is, I mean, it's almost like, how could he not?
Josh Downs here.
Talking to you into Josh Downs. Yeah. So anyway, that's going to be an interesting decision. But I do think, as far as going into the final week with some type of a lever to pull, it's at least fitting and fun that Kyle Pitts is the lever we can pull with tight end premium. It really elevates what the ceiling can look like for the tight ends, first of all. So anyway, that will be fun to see what happens. Maybe we get the Justin Fields rushing and a lot of scoring early from Fields and forces Atlanta to throw more than they really want to, and see what happens with it. That could be a lot of fun. But Shawn, we do sit in 14th. We're about 43 points behind. That kicker thing, some of the DeAndre Swift stuff. Really, to break it down, in the morning we were up to 5th when or the early games on Sunday. I say morning, being a Pacific Coast guy. When Breece Hall went off through the morning games, we definitely had less PMR, player minutes remaining than some of the other teams behind us, but we actually had as much or more than almost everyone in the top 10 to that point. Most of the teams in the top 10 had gotten scoring from that Thursday night game, Puka and Stafford and Kyron Williams, or other early game scoring like Breece Hall. There weren't a ton of games after that. There was the 3 in the afternoon, the Sunday Night Football, and then the 3 on Monday. So there was a chunk of games, but not a massive amount. We had 4 players left, Waddle, McBride, and then our kicker, which was Butker, and DeAndre Swift. The afternoon, we get the Waddle injury. We get McBride just being sort of okay. We get Swift the next day just being sort of okay. We talked about the kicker thing being pretty poor. Everything from that point forward went about as, I would argue, about as poor as it could go, or at least when you're in, everything's going right for you at that point, and you're visualizing that this is all going to come together, and it's the team of destiny. It's one of those things that I don't think we take we take for granted a little bit in fantasy, where when you win a championship, and I've won plenty, and everything kind of goes right on the team, I don't think you really appreciate how fortunate that is and how everything is going right. And because it just feels like it's a team of destiny. Everything's going to go right. Like that's the way, like my team just keeps scoring. This is awesome. When things go wrong, you feel like this is like unfair or whatever, but you definitely feel it as well. Like whatever it is, you feel the emotions. For this particular team, for example, everything was going right early, even though, like you said, James Cook doesn't do well on Saturday, but a lot of the teams near the top had James Cook because of what he had done in week 15. And so even I was sitting there going, well, if one player is going to have a floor game, that's the player that doesn't really differentiate us a ton. To your point, you still want your guys to score, even if they're not differentiating pieces, because it continues to, push you towards the top, right? And elevate.
All those people who don't have Cook but had Amari, you'd prefer to stay ahead of them as much as you can.
Right, exactly. Certainly you want your guys to score in any capacity. And like I was mentioning, Trey McBride being on both the top 2 teams, we still want McBride to score a lot of points next week. We'll have to catch those 2 teams through other means, but we have 13, or whatever. There's 13 teams total, 11 other teams that we need to pass as well. So you really do have to hit the nuts and have that 220-point week, and it gets scores from everywhere.
And to your point too, like if those things had happened in any other week, you're like, well, that's just the way fantasy football works. And I mean, did we really think we were going to have just like a random, 215-point game in week 7? You're like, yeah, I mean, this is good. This goes to the whole thing. But when you're trying to win the whole thing, you just have to run so hot all 3 weeks and all through the weekend. And so especially when you've already had the James Cook game, you're like, how do we get across that? How do we get across our quarterback not going off? And it just, after Breece Hall does it, you that McBride and Waddle are going to hit. And when they don't, the kicker deal, you're just like, the kicker stuff is so random. Both of those kickers are good. Harrison Butker. I mean, one of the things there is like he hadn't missed all season until we played him the last 2 weeks. And the reason you're playing him is that the Chiefs are more likely to lead and not be game scripted out of being able to attempt field goals in the second half. And for that portion of it to go, because they make those 2, I mean, they give up the 2 defensive touchdowns early on in that game, and he misses. I mean, even if he just doesn't miss, then he's set up with the
kick later.
Gaps to kick later. And it's funny because I believe the most recent time that we played Sanders, he missed early. and created a situation where the gaps wouldn't work. So we've been running cold on kicker. I mean, you can't get lucky with everything. We're still in great shape. If you had told us a week ago we'd be in 14th, we would be over the moon. If you had told us we'd been 5th and then 14th, we'd be like, well, that's not as cool.
Yeah, and so again, I was I'm doing it a very long-winded way, but being in 5th, we had the player minutes remaining. We had the situation to stay in the top 10. I was analyzing it all very much in real time. There's a lot of bias there, but looking at all the other players that were around us, the teams that were around us, there were several teams that were done at that point in the top 10. They're like, okay, well, we're going to finish ahead of them after this week. There are teams that are going to come up and threaten to pass us or pass us. There's a lot of good fantasy weapons still to play at that point. You're talking about the Miami-Dallas game hasn't started or is just starting when I'm doing all this research. And Kansas City, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and Baltimore all playing on Christmas. Like, yeah, there's a ton of really good players that Christian McCaffrey is waiting to play. This is not a Christian McCaffrey team that we have. A lot of guys that could certainly make an impact. But at that time, I felt like the median outcome was we would be in the top 10 in the back end of the top 10. I felt like the sort of worst case was we would be around like 15th because we did have a scoring gap over a lot of the teams that were even in like 25th and 30th were quite a ways back at that point. They would need a lot of scoring and a lot of really good games to catch us. Some of them did catch and pass us with those, those stacks and some of those elements that they were able to hit on in the later, the later games. But to your point, to be in 5th and be in that spot and be in a better position than a lot of the top 10 at that time, also knowing some teams were going to come past us. I thought if everything went perfect, there were scenarios where we were leading after this week. I mean, if Waddle really hits and McBride really hits, we could have been there. And so to see Waddle get injured, to see McBride, who has been so good, be pretty average in that game, to watch DeAndre Swift, miss those TDs, to watch the field goal kicking stuff, like you said, we're still in an awesome spot in 14th, like you have said. We still scored 170, like you said. In any other week, we would look at this and go, we had a 170-point week. That's a really strong regular season week. But when you're on the way to a 200-point week, and then it kind of took a lot of lower than 50th percentile outcomes to get to 170 when you could have been 180 plus, and you're seeing all these other teams that were at 200 plus that were able to climb the leaderboard on you. It is a little bit brutal, but that's sort of the way that it goes. We still have a shot. We still could just finishing top 10 would be like an incredible accomplishment. It'd be very, very fun. For those who want to know like what we're playing for, it is $1 million to first is something that has been, thrown around a lot, but it is pretty top heavy. It's 200,000 to second. It's 100,000 to third. It goes down pretty quickly from there. If we finish 10th, I think it's like 10,000, which obviously we'd be very excited to get. But it's not like I think you think when you hear $1 million to first that 10th is going to be more than 10,000. It's just sort of I think what the brain like you're going to win. You're still going to win. $100,000. It's like, well, it's not necessarily the way that it works. Not that we're doing this all for money. I just wanted to mention that.
Can't buy glory then.
Can't buy glory. That's really what it's about. We're just trying to win it for the Stealing Bananas brand, right? That would be so much fun and so exciting. All the listeners that have had to hear us talk about all our drafts and all of our teams over all these years. It's very, very cool to have this team here. Shawn, the other thing I do have to mention is we have two teams in the consolation round. We talked about how they didn't qualify after losing in their championships of their league playoffs. And so they're in the consolation round, which has a much smaller prize. I think it's $2,500 to first, but you can still win a little bit of a prize. Those two teams are both doing so well that they're in the top 15 of the consolation. There's a fewer teams in the consolation round than the main championship round, but both would be top 50 teams in the overall championship, which the overall championship is 800 teams have qualified for this. So for anyone who doesn't know, like the overall structure, it's 832. We had two that didn't qualify. They were a game away in their league playoffs. One of them was just a few points away from the auto qualification from the regular season back in week 13 is when that ended. Week 12 is when that ended.
It was just a couple of points away from winning that final.
Winning the final in week 14. So they both had multiple paths and were vaguely close.
The one where we gave up 46 points to kicker and defense in the final. So the kickers are Not on
They're not our
side
friend.
currently.
Yeah, we're not big fans of kickers at all right now. But I did want to mention in terms of I've gotten a lot of questions about the ways that we build our teams and how our teams have done, and we wanted to get into some postmortem stuff probably on the next show. We have a lot of time in the offseason to get into it. There's a lot of really fun topics that we are excited to talk to you guys about. But in terms of our strategies and the way that we build and those types of things, if either of these teams make it through, they're also top 50 in terms of trying to build teams that have a lot of firepower in the fantasy playoffs. This is the thing that we're constantly preaching. We have that. One of these teams does not have Breece Hall of the consolation teams, does not have Breece Hall. It's a McCaffrey team. It also has Puka. It had T. Higgins, who started to explode a little bit. And Brock Purdy, Sam Laporta team. That's the one that we were, I think, most excited about. Didn't make it through. We have another one that does have Breece and McCaffrey that didn't make it through. And that's that HAN team. We talked a lot about being really bummed that it didn't make it on the show recently. Those teams
have been big, but man, to have a Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall team, the team that Colin and I have in the Superflex finals and best ball in the FFPC is a CMC, Breece, James Cook team. And you don't know if those guys are going to hit, but it is exciting to have that mix. And Ben, one of the things that, if we had a couple more hours today, we were going to talk about is running back selection, running back talent, how you put that together. As you mentioned, we're going to have some entire shows dedicated to that. But one of the things I wrote in my intro to the Zero RB universe this week, and or in the early analysis portion there, as I'm thinking through it, talking about the EP numbers for the top guys. And we're going to talk a lot about the fantasy points over expectation, or however you want to phrase that. But the top four guys, you have Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs. You think through that, obviously Christian McCaffrey, the superstar, but the other two players, two rookies and one guy coming off an injury who's a second-year player, a lot of risk with those players. And you have to be able to stomach that when it doesn't work, when a J.K. Dobbins has a re-injury / obviously a separate injury, but something that could be potentially related or just more terrible luck, right? You've got to be able to stomach that. But these rookies, when you get to this point, someone like a Breece Hall, when you get to this point, these guys that are hyper talented, if you want to be in the mix to win the whole thing, my belief is that you've got to lean into that a little bit, or I guess you could have Amari Cooper. So those are the different ways that you can approach it. Ben, this has been so much fun. One of the things that, I want to mention as we close today is that, we talk about our team. One of the rules in fantasy is there's nothing less interesting than someone else's fantasy team. But because we've done these drafts, and a lot of these drafts have led to teams that are in good position, I'm hoping that means that there are lots of other RotoViz stealing signals, stealing bananas fans who are in their week 17 final this week. And for me, that's one of the real fun parts of it, that if we're doing well, there's at least a good chance that listeners, Ben, are doing well. And you should.
I think they are. The guys over at Signals Gold I talked to this week, a lot of them are doing well. I have one who's in 4 leagues. He made the championship in all 4 of his leagues. That was a really fun thing to hear. I'm like, man, that is crazy. But
I think I mentioned last week that one of our listeners had made 10 Best Ball Mania semifinals. Wow. So there has been, and we're not taking credit for this in any way, shape, or form. These drafters are fantastic, but it's exciting that the community is doing well.
Yeah, we love that. That's a big part of it. And when I was just talking through, the teams that didn't make it but have still scored well enough to be in the top 50. First of all, we're so fortunate that the team that did make it is the best one, and that has scored the best in 15 and 16 and is in 14th, and that's so exciting. But part of it is something that we've talked about over the years, that, you want to build these teams, as you just talked about with the rookies, that are good now. And sometimes that's frustrating for the first few months of the season. But for anyone who was still listening to the show in December, probably you're listening because your team is still in it. And it is that lesson in actuality. The scoring that we saw from guys like Breece Hall is so many of the things that we had talked about all year. You mentioned it, like J.K. Dobbins or Jonathan Taylor. A lot of those types of guys didn't hit as well. But the ways that these things can manifest, even the Jahmyr Gibbs game, that's what we're looking for. That's what we're building about. That's what we talk about all offseason. And in the first few months of the year, when those players aren't necessarily the stars in September and October, always, you're looking forward to, well, if I can just get my team in, it has that potential late. We saw that with some of our builds where even the ones that didn't get in, they still have that firepower and they're scoring right now. And hopefully a lot of our listeners, and like I said, I've heard a lot of very positive stuff from our listeners that suggests that a lot of them did do very well as well. So very grateful for everyone for listening and for trying these strategies. And like you said, obviously we're not taking the credit for it, but for the ones that want proof of concept, is I get that question a lot. Hopefully this is a helpful thing to internalize for future years.
Very much so. Well, again, happy holidays to everyone. That'll be this episode of Stealing Bananas. As Ben said, will maybe be a little inconsistent over the next couple of weeks as we do holiday and bowl game and just different family related things. But we're excited to get back with you. We'll have a ton more content soon. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always is Ben Gretch. You can follow him at Yards Per Gretch, Stealing Signals, Stealing Lines, Stealing Signals Gold. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. We'll talk to you soon.